The first married couple in human history left us no names, no wedding photograph, no marriage certificate, no ring, and probably no wedding ceremony at all. So how did anyone know they were married? Imagine going back thousands of years before cities, governments, written laws, churches, dating apps, or even the idea of a legal marriage. You are living in a small human community. Food isn't guaranteed. Predators are dangerous. Injuries can become deadly. And raising a child isn't something one person can easily do alone. Then, somewhere inside that group, two people begin spending more time together. They share food, they protect one another, they cooperate, they may raise children together, and eventually everyone around them begins to understand that these two people have formed a long-term partnership. But here's the fascinating question. At what point did that relationship become a marriage? And who decided who was allowed to marry whom? The strange answer is, we don't know exactly, and that's not because scientists haven't looked. It's because marriage isn't an object that survives in the ground. You can discover an ancient spear, you can discover a house, you can discover a burial, but you can't dig up an object and say, this was the first marriage. Marriage is a social institution, and social institutions can exist for generations before anyone writes them down. So the story of marriage probably doesn't begin with one person suddenly inventing it. It begins much earlier, with humans becoming unusually dependent on one another. Before marriage, there were social bonds. Humans have always been deeply social animals. Our ancestors shared food, cared for infants, built shelters, and depended on social networks. Human children also remained dependent on adults for a remarkably long period of development. That created a problem. A human baby couldn't simply be left alone after birth. Someone had to feed it, protect it, carry it, teach it, and eventually help it become an independent member of the group. This doesn't prove that prehistoric humans immediately created marriage, but it gives us an important clue. Long-term relationships could have real survival advantages. Two people who consistently cooperated could make raising children and managing daily life easier. But there was something even more important than cooperation: trust. Imagine living in a world without contracts, courts, bank accounts, or written promises. They weren't. Humans have always experienced jealousy, conflict, separation, competition, and changing relationships. But long-term bonds could still provide a framework for cooperation. And eventually, something even more important happened. Other people started caring about those relationships too. When a private relationship became a social relationship. Imagine two people living together. At first, their relationship might simply be personal, but then they have a child. Now, other people may need to know, who are this child's parents? Who is responsible for the child? At which relatives will help? Who provides food? Who belongs to which family? And what happens if the couple separates? The relationship is no longer just about two individuals. It affects the entire group. And that is where something resembling marriage could begin to emerge. Not necessarily through a ceremony, not necessarily through a priest, but through recognition. A community could begin to recognize that certain people belong together and that they had particular responsibilities toward each other and their children. This is important because marriage has never had one universal form. Anthropological research shows enormous variation in human marriage practices. Some societies have arranged marriages, some emphasize courtship, some involve bride wealth or bride service, and societies have historically practiced both monogamous and plural marriages. The exact ancestral form of human marriage remains uncertain because direct archaeological evidence is limited. So there probably wasn't one original human wedding template. There were many experiments. Different societies solved the same basic problems in different ways, and one of the biggest questions was, who gets to choose? Who chose your partner? Today, many people think of marriage as a personal choice. You meet someone, you fall in love, you decide whether you want to spend your life together, but that hasn't been the only human model. In some societies, families played a major role. Why? Because marriage could connect more than two individuals. It could connect families, it could create alliances, it could transfer wealth or resources, it could determine inheritance, and it could influence the social position of future children. So, choosing a marriage partner could become a decision with consequences far beyond romance. In some cultures, parents or relatives arranged marriages. In others, individuals had more freedom to choose. And some societies developed rules about exactly who you were allowed or forbidden to marry. You might not be allowed to marry a close relative. You might be expected to marry outside your own clan. You might be encouraged to marry into another family or social group. These rules are fascinating because they reveal something important. marriage wasn't only about choosing a person, it was also about deciding where that person belonged inside the larger social network. One comparative study of hunter-gatherer societies has even suggested that arranged marriage may have a very deep history, potentially reaching back to early modern human migrations. But this is a reconstruction from comparative evidence, not a surviving prehistoric marriage record. And then humans discovered something that would change the importance of marriage dramatically: property. When land changed marriage. For most of human history, many communities depended heavily on mobility and shared resources. But beginning roughly within the last 12,000 years, agriculture and permanent settlements began transforming human societies. Now imagine something that didn't exist in the same way for constantly moving groups: a field, a house, animals, stored grain, tools, land that a family could claim and pass down. Suddenly, another question became extremely important. Who inherits what? If a person dies, who receives their land? Who receives their animals? Who belongs to the family? And who are the legitimate children? Marriage could now become deeply connected to property and inheritance. A relationship wasn't simply about two people living together anymore. It could determine where wealth went after someone died. It could connect one family to another, and it could help establish who belonged to the next generation. This is one reason marriage gradually became much more than a private relationship. It became a system, and eventually, humans started writing that system down. The day marriage entered written history, one of the clearest early windows into legally regulated marriage comes from ancient Mesopotamia. By the 2nd millennium BCE, Babylonian law dealt with marriage, divorce, property, children, inheritance, and the responsibilities of spouses. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most famous examples, and here's what makes it fascinating. It doesn't look like someone is inventing marriage. It looks like a society that has already been dealing with marriage for a long time and is now writing rules about what happens when things go wrong. What happens if a husband divorces his wife? What happens to her dowry? What happens to the children? What happens to property? What happens if one spouse dies? What happens if someone violates the rules of marriage? The code contains laws covering marriage, divorce, adultery, incest, remarriage, property, inheritance, and family relationships. And that gives us a powerful clue. The written law probably wasn't the beginning of marriage. It was evidence that marriage had already become important enough for society to regulate. The paperwork came later. The social behavior came first. So, who was the first married couple? We don't know. There is no archaeological discovery that can confidently give us the names of the first husband and wife, and there probably never will be, because the transition from partnership to marriage wasn't necessarily one dramatic moment. There may not have been a day when someone stood before a crowd and announced, "Today we have invented marriage." Instead, imagine something much slower. Two people form a long-term bond. Their children become part of the community. Their families recognize the relationship. The community develops expectations. Those expectations become customs. The customs become traditions. And eventually, governments and religious institutions begin formalizing them. That's not one invention. That's evolution. Was the first marriage about love? Here's where the story gets even more complicated. Was the first marriage created because humans fell in love? Probably not in the modern sense. Was it created purely for survival? That answer is also too simple. Human relationships can contain many motivations at the same time: attraction, affection, sexual relationships, child rearing, protection, resource sharing, family alliances, social status, property, inheritance, and personal choice. The mistake is thinking that ancient marriage must have had one single purpose. It didn't. Different societies created different rules because humans were trying to solve different problems. And even within the same society, individual people could have had completely different reasons for choosing a partner. One person might marry for love, another for family pressure, another for security, another for status, another because they simply wanted a particular person. The institution could be social, while the feelings inside it were deeply personal. So what was the first marriage? Maybe it wasn't a ceremony. Maybe it wasn't a contract. Maybe it wasn't even something the couple themselves had a special word for. Maybe it was simply the moment when a relationship became recognized by other people. Two people were no longer just together. They had responsibilities. Their children had a recognized place. Their families became connected, and the community knew what their relationship meant. That may be one of the most important ideas in the entire history of marriage, because marriage wasn't created only by two people choosing each other. It was created when society began saying, "We recognize this relationship." And once society recognized it, rules followed. Who could marry? Who couldn't? What happened if they separated? Who raised the children? Who inherited property? Who owed what to whom? And eventually, governments and religions added their own answers. The wedding we know today came much later. The modern wedding? with rings, formal ceremonies, legal documents, photographs, elaborate clothing, and carefully planned celebrations, is only one chapter in this enormous history. The basic human problem is much older. How do two people create a stable relationship inside a larger community? For thousands of years, humans kept experimenting with different answers. Some valued family, some valued property and children, some wanted alliances, and many simply wanted someone they could trust. That's why we can't point to the first marriage in history. There was probably no single first wedding. Instead, a gradual transformation took place. A private bond became a social expectation. That expectation became a custom. The custom became a tradition. And eventually, marriage became an institution that societies and governments could regulate. So, who was the first married couple? We don't know their names. We don't know where they lived. And we don't know what their wedding looked like. But somewhere in the deep human past, two people formed a bond that lasted long enough and mattered enough that their community began to recognize it. Maybe that was the real beginning of marriage. Not a ring, not a ceremony, not a document, but a simple human idea. You are my partner. I will stand with you, and together we will face what comes next. Maybe marriage wasn't invented on a single day. Maybe humanity invented it, one relationship at a time.